She sat quietly in the crowded cabin, looking out of the small oval window, the clouds drifting like slow-moving mountains in the sky. The hum of the engines gave a steady rhythm, almost calming, yet her heart was far from calm. She had taken flights before, but this one felt different from the very beginning. The crew was busy moving up and down the aisle, offering drinks and smiles. Passengers chatted, some laughed. Some tried to sleep. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal flight. But inside her, something felt uneasy. It was not fear exactly, it was more like a sense of awareness, a sharpness that told her to stay alert. She leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment. Her thoughts drifted to her past. Most people on board saw her as just another passenger, dressed simply, blending with the crowd. They had no idea of the training she once had. They had no idea of the voice that still echoed in her memory, a voice calling her by a call sign, a name she had earned in years of service. But she had left that world behind, or at least she thought she had. She wanted peace, to live quietly, away from the noise of orders and missions. Yet life has a way of testing people when they least expect it. A sudden jolt shook the plane. It was light, but enough to make passengers look up. Nervous smiles spread. A man across the aisle tightened his grip on his armrest. The flight attendant quickly reassured them, saying it was only turbulence. Still, she opened her eyes. Her gaze sharp, something was not right. The minutes dragged on, and she noticed the crew exchanging uneasy glances. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm yet unusually tense. He explained that they were facing a technical issue, but everything was under control. His tone, however, betrayed something more. It was not just a technical issue. She knew that tone well. It was the same tone commanders used when danger was near, but panic had to be avoided. Her instincts kicked in. She sat straighter, watching carefully, listening to every detail. The air inside the cabin seemed heavier now. Passengers whispered among themselves. A child began to cry softly, and the mother hushed him, trying to stay calm herself. She remembered the long drills, the emergency protocols, the way every situation was broken down step by step. Her mind was already calculating possibilities. Altitude, weather, route. She did not want to interfere. She was no longer part of that world. She was just a passenger. But could she really sit still while others were at risk? The flight attendants were moving faster now, whispering to each other. One of them even walked past her row twice without reason. It was clear something was escalating. She finally leaned forward, pressing the service button. When the attendant came, she asked a simple question, soft yet direct. The attendant hesitated before answering. Her eyes confirmed it. The issue was serious. Moments later, the captain's voice returned. He explained that communication with air traffic control had been lost. They were trying different channels, but no response was coming through. The plane was flying, but it was alone in the sky, cut off. A hush fell over the cabin. People began to understand this was no ordinary delay. Fear spread quickly. Some passengers demanded answers. Others prayed quietly. She stayed calm. Though inside her chest, her heart beat faster. She knew exactly what this could mean. She had lived those scenarios before. She knew the risks of silence in the sky. Planes without communication raised alarms, and alarms in the sky meant fighter jets could be launched. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the choice forming inside her mind. She could stay silent, remain the invisible passenger she had chosen to become. Or she could step forward, reveal who she was, and use the training and call sign she had promised never to use again. The child's cries grew louder. A man's voice rose in anger, demanding the truth from the crew. The attendants struggled to calm him. Panic was building. She closed her eyes for a brief second, breathing deeply. She could almost hear the echoes of engines. The voice of her commander calling her by her sign, reminding her of duty, reminding her of the promise that no life should be wasted if she could prevent it. Her eyes opened, steady and strong. The time had come. She was no longer just a passenger. She was someone who had been shaped for this very moment. And whether the world recognized it or not, she was ready to stand again. The seatbelt light flickered above. The engines roared a little louder as the plane adjusted its course, and in that moment, she made her choice. She would not sit back, she would save them, even if it meant calling out into the silence with the name she had once buried. The cabin remained unaware of the storm about to unfold, but in her heart she already knew. This flight would not be remembered for its delay or its turbulence. It would be remembered for the moment she stepped forward, and the moment the sky itself answered her call sign. The cabin air grew thick as silence spread. People were restless now, shifting in their seats, their faces pale with worry. The crew tried to smile, but their eyes betrayed the fear they carried. She could feel it in her bones. The flight was on the edge of chaos. She unbuckled her seatbelt quietly, ignoring the surprised glance of the man beside her. He whispered something about staying seated, but she did not reply. Her steps were steady as she walked down the aisle, every eye turned toward her, wondering why a passenger was moving at such a time. She stopped near the galley where two attendants were whispering nervously. They froze as she approached before they could ask her to sit down. She spoke calmly. Her words were not loud, but they carried authority. She told them she had training, that she could help if they would let her speak to the captain. At first they hesitated, looking at each other, but something in her eyes made them pause. It was the kind of look that carried weight, the kind of look that came from someone who had once faced storms greater than this. One of the attendants finally nodded and led her toward the cockpit. Passengers watched with wide eyes, whispering among themselves. Some looked hopeful, others suspicious. Everyone felt the tension of the unknown. When the door to the cockpit opened, the atmosphere shifted. The captain and co-pilot were locked in a desperate struggle with failing radios. Screens flickered, warning lights glowed. Their voices were tight as they tried again and again to raise a response. She stood at the threshold for only a second before stepping in. The captain turned sharply, ready to demand why she was there, but she spoke first. She introduced herself not with her name, but with the call sign that once defined her. The cockpit went quiet for a brief moment. Only the hum of the engines filled the space. Recognition flickered in the captain's eyes. It was not a call sign many would know. Only those who had flown. Only those who had read the stories of pilots who had faced the sky when it was at its most unforgiving. He lowered his voice and asked if it was really her. She only nodded. The co-pilot moved aside slightly. Giving her space, without hesitation, she sat down in the small jump seat behind them. Her hands rested on her knees, steady. She asked for the details. The captain explained quickly. Radio's gone, no confirmation of position. And now the navigation system was starting to show irregularities. Her mind worked fast, piecing together the situation. She knew what would happen next. A silent plane without communication over restricted zones was not seen as a mistake. It was seen as a threat, and threats in the sky were met with fighters. The captain knew it too. He looked at her. Searching for answers, she could see the weight he carried, the lives of everyone on board pressing against his shoulders. She told him calmly to hold altitude steady and to stay on current heading. If the fighters came, they would expect discipline, not panic outside the sky stretched wide and endless. But to her it felt smaller, like a tunnel closing in. She could almost hear the roar of engines approaching, the thunder of wings cutting through the air. Back in the cabin, passengers felt the shift, though they did not know why. Some prayed softly, some held hands. Children clung to their parents, and yet, when she walked out of the cockpit a few minutes later, her face was calm. She did not speak of what was coming, but her presence carried reassurance. She returned to her seat, and for a while, the plane flew quietly. It was a fragile piece, one that hung on the edge of the unknown. Then, without warning, a faint shadow passed over the wing. Gasps erupted from the windows as passengers pressed close to the glass. Two sleek shapes darted alongside, their gray bodies shining in the sun. They were F-22s, powerful, silent, circling like hawks. The cabin erupted into fearful murmurs. People asked if they were in danger. If the plane was being forced down, panic began to swell again. But she leaned closer to the window, her eyes fixed on the fighter jet nearest to them. And then it happened, the moment she had both dreaded and expected. Through the radio system, patched weakly into the cabin speakers, a voice boomed. It called out a name, not the captain's name, not the flight number, but her call sign. The passengers fell into stunned silence, every head turned toward her, disbelief and hope mixing in their faces. No one understood why, but they knew it meant something. Something that changed the story of this flight forever. Her chest rose slowly as she breathed. For years she had left that name behind, buried it under ordinary life, but now, in the silence of a plane hanging between safety and danger, the sky itself had remembered her. The voice of the F-22 pilot was waiting. The call sign hung in the air. She knew then. The moment had come to answer. The cabin was frozen in silence. The voice that came through the speakers had called a name no passenger expected. Not the captain, not the crew, but hers. It was her old call sign, a piece of her past that was never meant to return. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Some were wide with confusion, others with curiosity. A young boy sitting near the window whispered to his mother, asking what that strange word meant. She could feel the weight of every gaze pressing against her, waiting for her to move, to speak. Her chest rose and fell slowly. She kept her eyes on the wing outside, where the fighter jet kept pace, sleek and sharp like a guardian. The voice repeated itself, firm but calm, again asking for her call sign to respond. She closed her eyes for a moment. Memories rushed in, long nights in the hangar, the scent of fuel and metal, the endless drills, the echo of her commander's voice reminding her of duty, reminding her that the call sign was never just a word. It was a bond, a promise. She opened her eyes, steady now. She reached for the overhead speaker button near the crew seat where she had been allowed earlier. Her voice came out calm, almost too calm for the passengers listening. She spoke only one word, the reply to her call sign. The cabin filled with gasps. People realized that she was not just another passenger. She had once belonged to the very sky they were flying through. The radio crackled, and then the fighter pilot's tone shifted. There was respect in his voice now. He confirmed that they had been searching for this aircraft. The communication loss had triggered a potential threat response, but the presence of her call sign had changed everything. Instead of a target, this flight was now under her protection. The captain in the cockpit exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. The co-pilot shot a glance backward, eyes wide. He had never seen such a moment. It was as if the sky itself had recognized her. In the cabin, passengers whispered in disbelief. Some leaned closer to each other, asking who she was. Some pointed at her quietly. A few simply stared in awe. For the first time since the turbulence began, hope spread among them, but she did not bask in it. She knew this was not the end. Fighters were alongside them, yes, but that also meant the situation was fragile. If the plane deviated, if panic spread, things could still turn dangerous. She needed to keep the cabin calm, to remind everyone that safety was within reach. She stood slowly, her movements calm, deliberate. She faced the passengers. Her voice carried steady across the cabin as she spoke. She told them there was no need for fear, that the jets outside were not enemies but protectors. She explained in simple words that they were guiding the plane safely. Her words had weight, not because they were loud, but because they came with honesty. She had no uniform now, no rank on her shoulders. Yet when she spoke, people believed. Parents calmed their children. Men and women unclenched their fists. The cabin slowly softened. The fighter jets outside moved with precision, one rising slightly above, the other dipping lower. Their presence was like a shield, guiding the plane through the invisible lanes of the sky. And every time she glanced at them, she felt a strange mix of relief and heaviness. They were her past, a world she thought she had left behind. And yet here they were, answering her call sign once again. The captain invited her back into the cockpit briefly. He asked her advice. She studied the instruments, the faint static on the radios. She instructed them to keep altitude and not attempt sudden maneuvers. She explained that with fighter escorts, the safest move was steadiness. It was not just about flying. It was about trust, showing the jets outside that this plane was under control. Back in her seat, the minutes felt longer than hours every second. She expected another call over the radio, another command, another decision to be made. But instead she listened to the faint chatter between the jets and ground control. She could hear her call sign repeated more than once, spoken with respect, as if she had never disappeared from their world. A child passed her a small toy airplane from across the aisle. He smiled nervously and whispered that she was brave. She looked at him and smiled softly. Her heart ached a little. She had not wanted recognition, not like this. But sometimes the world decided for you then. The voice of the fighter pilot came again, louder now. The message was clear. Ground control had re-established a partial link. They were guiding the aircraft toward safety, but the order that followed was unusual. They asked her, not the captain, to confirm the route. They wanted her judgment, her trust. Gasps rippled through the cockpit and cabin alike. For a moment, everyone understood the truth. She was no ordinary traveler. The fate of the plane rested on her words. She leaned forward, speaking clearly into the microphone. Her voice steady, she confirmed the heading. She assured them that this plane would follow without error, and as she released the button, a strange silence fell inside her. For the first time in years, she was not running from her past. She was living it again. The plane adjusted its course, and the fighters shifted alongside, graceful and commanding in the cabin. Passengers pressed against the windows, staring in awe. They would never forget the sight of two mighty jets guiding them home. And they would never forget the woman in row 12 who stood when no one else could. But in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. For when the sky calls your name, it never lets you go so easily. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and a wave of unease rippled through the passengers. For a moment, the steady hum of the engines seemed to grow louder. Filling every corner of the plane, she kept her hands still on her lap. But her eyes never left the window. The F-22s were still there, one on each side, their wings glinting in the fading sunlight. Guardians in the endless sky. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. He told the passengers that the situation was under control, that they had regained limited contact with ground control. But even as he spoke, she could hear the slight tremor in his tone. She knew what he was not saying. The plane's systems were not fully stable, and they were still a long way from safety. She closed her eyes, listening. There was a subtle vibration beneath her seat, something irregular, not enough for others to notice but clear to her. Years of training had sharpened her senses. She knew the aircraft was carrying more strain than it should. Her instincts whispered that something else was coming. The first challenge had been the silence in the sky, but now it felt as if the plane itself was being tested. A sudden ding broke her thoughts. The overhead sign flickered, warning the crew. The attendants rushed to secure carts and guide passengers. Fear returned quickly. Children clung tighter to their parents. A woman began to cry softly in the back rows. The captain asked her into the cockpit once more. She rose without hesitation, her footsteps steady even as the floor trembled slightly beneath her. When she entered, the look on the pilots' faces confirmed it. The left engine was losing stability. The co-pilot pointed at the gauges, his voice tense. He explained that the engine was still running but was showing erratic behavior. It could hold or it could fail without warning. The captain turned to her, his eyes searching. He did not need to say the words. They both knew what it meant, one engine out here, with communication only half restored, would bring them dangerously close to disaster. She studied the instruments carefully. Her mind moved fast, weighing every option. She remembered her own missions, the nights she had guided damaged aircraft through storms, the times when one wrong decision meant lives lost. She spoke calmly, telling them to reduce strain, keep the aircraft steady, not fight the turbulence but move with it. The captain followed her words, and slowly the readings began to settle. Not perfect, but better. For the first time in minutes, the cockpit breathed again. When she returned to the cabin, the passengers were waiting, eyes filled with questions they could not ask. She gave them only a small nod. A quiet assurance it was enough. Hope lingered. Fragile but present, then the radio crackled again. The voice of the F-22 pilot came through, sharper now. He informed them that ground control had cleared an emergency landing route. But there was another problem. A storm was forming ahead, a wide band of clouds stretching across their path. They could see it even from the cabin windows. A dark wall rising in the distance, gasps echoed through the rows. Someone whispered that it looked like a barrier. Another prayed aloud. The passengers felt trapped between the failing engine and the storm. She pressed her hand against the cool surface of the window, her reflection staring back at her. This was the test she had always known would come, not in the same form but with the same weight. Her choices carried lives. She stood once more, the crew giving way as she walked to the intercom. Her voice filled the cabin, calm and clear. She told everyone the truth, that they would be flying through a storm, but that they were not alone. She pointed to the jets outside, reminding the passengers that those pilots were with them, guiding them, watching every movement. Her words steadied the cabin. It did not erase the fear, but it gave it shape. Fear without guidance becomes chaos, but fear with purpose becomes courage. And now the passengers sat straighter, holding hands, bracing together. The storm drew closer, the cabin darkened. The storm finally loosened its grip. The sky cleared in patches, revealing streaks of fading sunlight. The passengers sighed in relief, believing the worst had passed, but she knew the truth. This was only the calm before the hardest part. The plane still carried a wounded engine. The communication was fragile. And ahead lay the most delicate moment of all. The landing, She glanced toward the cockpit where the captain and co-pilot spoke quickly, their hands moving over the controls. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but cautious. He told the passengers they would be preparing for an emergency landing. He urged everyone to remain seated. To follow instructions, the words were calm, but beneath them was urgency. The passengers shifted nervously. Some whispered prayers, others squeezed hands. A few closed their eyes tightly, trying to shut out the reality. The crew moved down the aisle, securing everything, checking belts, giving quiet encouragement, but eyes kept drifting back to her. The woman who had spoken with the jets, the one whose call sign still echoed in the cabin. She felt the weight of their silent trust pressing down on her. She had not asked for it, but it was there, undeniable. Her call sign was no longer a secret, it was a promise. The captain called her forward once more. When she stepped into the cockpit, the air was heavy with tension. The runway was visible on the screens, but the path toward it was complicated. Wind currents still battered the aircraft, and the damaged engine threatened to fail completely at any moment. The captain explained quickly. They would need absolute precision to bring the plane down safely. She studied the instruments, her eyes sharp. She asked for the wind direction, the angle of descent. The emergency procedures available at the airport, the co-pilot answered. His voice clipped with stress. She nodded slowly. Then she turned her gaze toward the fighters outside. Still circling, still waiting. The radio crackled. The F-22 pilot's voice came through. He said they would stay close until the wheels touched the ground. But the rest was up to them. And then he added something else. Words that carried more weight than the roar of engines. He told her the sky trusted her. Her throat tightened for a moment. She looked at the controls, at the pilots who waited for her words, at the passengers behind who sat on the edge of hope and fear. She did not wear the uniform anymore, but in that moment, she carried the same responsibility as before. She gave her instructions clearly, firmly. She told the captain to keep the descent smooth, to avoid overcorrecting. She told the co-pilot to monitor the engine carefully, and she herself would handle communication with the escorts. As the nose of the plane tilted downward, the cabin shook. Gasps and cries rose. The descent had begun. Outside, the storm clouds were behind them, but the runway ahead still looked distant. The ground was approaching fast, yet not fast enough. Time stretched painfully. She leaned close to the radio, confirming every move with the fighters. Their voices were steady, guiding, encouraging. At times they asked her for updates, not the captain, always her, and she answered with calm precision, her call sign flowing from her lips like it had never left her. In the cabin, people clung to one another. Some cried, some prayed, some simply stared straight ahead. But when they saw her return briefly from the cockpit, her eyes steady, her voice calm as she told them to prepare, something changed. Fear was still there, but now it was balanced with courage. They believed because she believed. The runway lights appeared at last, glowing like a beacon in the fading light. The captain's hands tightened on the controls. The co-pilot called out numbers, altitude, speed, angle. The aircraft trembled. The damaged engine groaned as if it might give up at any moment. Her heart beat faster, but her face remained calm. She whispered her call sign softly under her breath. Not for the passengers, not for the crew, but for herself. A reminder of who she had once been, of who she was in this moment. The final seconds stretched long. The wheels were lowering, the wings vibrating against the currents. Every passenger held their breath. The runway rushed closer. The captain guided, the co-pilot steadied, and she gave one last instruction through clenched determination. Hold steady. No sudden corrections. The tires struck the ground with a jolt. The cabin shook violently. Screams rang out. But the plane was still upright. The brakes screeched, the nose tilted forward. The aircraft wavered dangerously, swaying as if it might tip. She gripped the back of the pilot's chair, her jaw tight, urging with her presence alone to keep the line. And then slowly, painfully, the plane steadied. Its wheels rolled hard against the runway, slowing inch by inch, second by second, until at last, with a shudder and a heavy groan, it came to a halt. For a moment, there was no sound. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the soft hiss of the engines cooling. Then like a wave, voices erupted. People cried, shouted, clapped. Some fell into each other's arms. Some wept uncontrollably. The relief was overwhelming. She sat back, closing her eyes. Her chest rose and fell in slow, deep breaths. The mission was complete, not in the way she had once known missions, but no less heavy she had carried them through. She had answered the call sign. She had given everything she had, but as the applause echoed, as the passengers whispered her name with awe, she felt something deeper stirring. She had thought this was the end. A single act of return, but she knew better now. The sky had called her back, and the sky does not release its own so easily. The cabin doors opened slowly, and the cool night air rushed inside. Passengers clung to their seats for a moment, unable to believe they had touched the ground. Some laughed nervously, others wept openly. A few whispered prayers of thanks. The flight attendants guided them carefully, urging calm as they began the long process of disembarking. She remained seated near the front. Watching quietly, people walked past her, their faces etched with gratitude. Many paused just to glance at her. Some whispered a soft thank you. Others simply nodded with tear-filled eyes. They did not know her full story, yet they knew enough. She had been the reason the plane had made it down. Outside, flashing lights filled the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and ground crew surrounded the aircraft. Their sirens were quiet, but their presence heavy. Beyond them, she could see the silhouettes of the F-22s, still circling overhead before finally peeling away into the night. Their mission complete, their guardianship ended. The captain approached her, his face pale from exhaustion but his eyes steady. He extended a hand, his voice was low as he thanked her. Not as a passenger, but as someone who had carried them through. She shook her head softly, saying only that the crew had done their part. But the captain's eyes told a different story. He knew the truth. Without her, the outcome would have been very different. As she stepped out onto the tarmac, the cool air hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, she closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Feeling the weight of the night lift slightly, she had done what needed to be done. But the emotions she had held back were finally beginning to surface. Her hands trembled as she hid them in her pockets. Passengers gathered a short distance away, some still shaken, others talking rapidly, trying to process what had happened. Many of them looked toward her, whispers spreading. Some asked who she really was. Some guessed she was military. Others thought she was part of the crew in disguise. None of them knew the full truth. Only the call sign that had echoed through the radio. Soon, officials approached. Their uniforms marked them as both airport security and military representatives. They asked for her quietly, not with force but with respect. The passengers fell silent as they watched her step forward, escorted gently toward a waiting vehicle near the runway. Inside the small airport building, the air was heavy with questions. Reporters had already gathered outside, their cameras flashing, demanding answers, but inside, the officials spoke to her directly. Their tone was formal, but softened by something more: recognition. They asked if it was truly her, if she was the same woman who had once carried that call sign. She gave a small nod, not proudly, not dramatically, simply acknowledging what could no longer be hidden. For years she had lived quietly, away from the noise of uniforms and commands. But tonight, the sky had spoken her name again, and the world had listened. The military officer across from her leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. He admitted that her call sign still carried weight, still lived in records and memories. He told her the fighter pilots had recognized it instantly, that it had changed the course of their orders. Without her, the plane might have been forced down differently, harshly. She had not only saved the passengers, she had prevented a greater tragedy. She lowered her gaze, listening quietly. She had not wanted this attention. She had only wanted to help when no one else could. But now she was the center of something larger. Her name would spread. Her story would not remain just between those on the plane. Outside the building, the passengers were still gathered. Some refused to leave until they saw her again. They wanted to thank her, to know the face of the woman who had stood up when fear filled the air. The officials offered her protection, a car to leave quietly, but she hesitated. She glanced toward the glass doors where families held their children close, where men and women stood waiting, their eyes searching for her. She knew then that she could not disappear into the shadows so easily. She stepped outside and silence fell instantly. Dozens of faces turned to her. Tears shone in their eyes. Smiles broke through their exhaustion. A little girl broke away from her mother and ran toward her, holding out a drawing she had made on the flight, a scribbled picture of a plane and 2 jets in the sky. The girl's small voice called her a hero. Her chest tightened. She knelt down, taking the picture gently. Her eyes met the child's, and in that simple moment, All the weight of the night melted into something pure. Gratitude. The passengers began to clap softly one by one until the sound grew louder. Filling the air, it was not the thunder of engines, not the roar of the storm, but it carried just as much power. She stood among them, her eyes damp, her heart heavy and light at the same time. For years she had walked silently, hiding the name that once defined her, but now the world had found her again, not because she sought recognition, but because she had answered when the sky called. And as the applause echoed under the open night, she realized something she had long resisted. She was no longer just the woman who wanted to leave it all behind. She was the woman who had saved them, the woman whose call sign still lived in the air. The night had grown quiet. The flashing lights on the runway had dimmed. The crowd of passengers had finally begun to disperse, yet her presence still lingered in their whispers, in their eyes that carried both relief and wonder. They would go home and tell their families about the woman who answered the call sign in the sky, about how she saved them when the world felt like it was ending. She sat alone now in a small waiting room away from the noise. A cup of untouched water sat on the table. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but her mind was alive with thoughts. The weight of what had happened pressed against her. She had wanted to live in silence, away from the noise of the past, but silence had been broken, and there was no way back to the life she thought she had chosen. The door opened quietly and the captain stepped in, his uniform still damp from sweat, his eyes heavy from exhaustion. He sat across from her. For a long moment he said nothing, then finally he spoke. He told her that no words could ever match what she had done, that her calm had carried the crew when fear nearly broke them. He admitted that when he first saw her stand, he had not believed she could change anything, but then, he said softly, she had changed everything. She listened quietly, her eyes lowered. She did not need thanks, not from him, not from anyone. She had done what she had to do, nothing more, nothing less. But she also knew that this was no small moment. It would live in the memories of every person on that flight, perhaps even in the history of those jets that answered her call. When the captain left, another figure entered. A military officer, his uniform crisp, his posture sharp. He studied her silently for a moment before speaking. He told her that the fighter pilots had filed their report, and that her call sign had been marked in it. He explained that there had been hesitation at first, but once they realized it was truly her, the orders had changed instantly. Her presence had prevented a catastrophe. She asked him softly if the world would know. The officer hesitated before replying. He said it was already spreading. The passengers would not stay silent, and neither would the ground crews who had watched. Her story was already alive. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing deeply. She had spent years trying to bury that name, the name that had once been shouted across radios, painted on aircraft, etched into records, and yet here it was, alive again, stronger than ever. Outside the waiting room, she could hear footsteps, she could hear voices, whispers, flashes of cameras. The world was waiting, not just for a survivor's story, but for hers. She stood slowly, her shoulders straightening. Her steps were steady as she walked to the door. When it opened, the night air hit her once more, and beyond it she saw a crowd, not just passengers but reporters, airport staff, even strangers who had gathered after hearing fragments of the story. Flashlights flickered, voices called questions. People asked who she was. They asked why the fighter jets had called her name. They asked if she was military, if she was a hero. The noise swirled around her like another storm. But she did not rush. She lifted her hand slightly, and silence grew. The crowd leaned closer. Waiting, she spoke softly, yet her words carried across the air. She said she was no hero. She said she had been a passenger like everyone else. But when the moment came, she simply answered a call she could not ignore. Her voice was steady, and for a long moment, the crowd was silent. Then the applause began again. Rising, echoing across the runway, she felt the sound in her chest. Not as noise, but as something deeper. The little girl who had given her the drawing earlier stood at the front, clutching her mother's hand. She held the picture high, smiling brightly. The simple image of a plane and two jets above it looked almost sacred in that moment. A child's version of history. Her chest ached not with pain, but with a truth she could no longer deny. She had thought she left the sky behind, but the sky had never left her. Her call sign was not just a name. It was part of who she was, part of who she would always be. She turned away from the crowd at last, walking quietly toward the dark horizon. The noise faded behind her, but the weight of the night remained. She knew her life would never return to what it was. She had been seen, remembered, called upon, and now, whether she wanted it or not, the world would carry her story. Some would call her a hero, others would call her a mystery, but for those who had been on that flight, she would always be the woman who stood when no one else could, the one who answered the call sign when the sky demanded it. And as she walked into the night, her shadow stretching long under the runway lights, she whispered it to herself one last time, her call sign, the word that had once belonged only to the sky. Now it belonged to the world.